Okay, so you're and your is what isn't doing this. We'll try and get a minute. Yeah. Okay. We'll just note that he'll turn up in 10. So I'll just say, welcome everyone, and we'll declare the meeting open. We have apology from Ed Cooney and Neil for technical, and Neil is attempting to join us. We should be okay because he managed to manage to do this. Okay, so we have minutes of the previous meeting, 4th of June. Gosh, that seems like such a
Yeah.
Any comments or queries on those minutes?
No.
Okay, I will move that we accept those. Someone like to second that?
I'll second that.
Thank you. Those in favour say aye.
No.
Right, excellent. Okay, so confirm the minutes. We've got declarations of interest. Any changes, amendments to those? Okay. Right, so first up we've got insurance update.
We're waiting for the insurance. They're not here yet either.
Okay.
So we're getting that issue.
And just saying that still the wrong.
Can I ask a question that's not directly related to it?
Sure.
While they're not here, or before they arrive. Standing timber, I just couldn't think where our timber is. I knew we had Coronet, but it's gone. Where there other timber assets, Louise?
I think we've got some forestry still in Maysbury, we've got some on Steamfleet Road, we've got some at Roxburgh.
And that's actual forestry, not just crap wild and pine, but really grow
We planted the forestry.
Right. Cool.
I think at Naseby it might include
We've got
quite a bit of wild.
We had some going down, and we because the price of carbon credits we didn't replant, but we had some forestry in Naseby. I'm not sure how much.
I think it's surrounded by other forestry, which means
Yeah.
it's got trees that it's not.
Yeah.
So it was Sandflat and Naseby, where was that on the keyboard?
Is the Sandflat Road, has that actually got any commercial value? Because it hasn't been silvicultured or.
Yeah, of course.
I don't
So
know the
we're
value
just
off the
going to
top of my head, Nigel,
on
what
the
you
new
had.
technology
If I don't report this, actually brought it with me, but there is some value, there's even value in the Roxburgh. It's blown down, and the prices right now are quite good, I understand.
Is there still value even? Oh, we just replant.
Yeah, so we have to look at the whole picture of carbon credits and what the alternative use would be and what we would plant with, and whether we might even plant native forest rather than this
Imagine some pressure.
wilding pine thing and the returns. So Garrett's actually going to talk to the Tibet Valley Community at the next meeting just to let them know what the thinking is around the trees that have blown over in Tibet.
Excellent. That's just what I know.
Can I just say the 945?
Yeah, no pressure. Where are you guys with carbon measuring?
Not that very well.
Sorry,
Carbon measuring.
Carbon measuring.
or carbon, the actual current state of carbon.
We've done very well. We've measured it all
How
and been
your criteria?
all accredited, so we are accredited. And so we have our carbon emissions reduction plan in place. And I think we're looking at over 50% reduction in 3
So
years.
when did you get the accreditation?
Just recently.
Okay, so that'll be in next year's annual report.
Yeah, I
No
suppose
mention of
that
it in
doesn't
this
seem to
one.
pop up in the annual report.
No.
It doesn't.
So, no.
Yeah, but we can send you the report.
Oh, yeah, no, that's all right, but I was just thinking that's the sort of, you know, so that would be next year's probably, so you've got you'd have the 2020 then, or 21,
We've got projects.
and then you've got your plans, so you've got your starting point and you've got your plans, so for the 2022 annual report, you'd be able to rely, just to know. Okay.
My expectation is that there will be a legal requirement put on it. At this point, I don't know.
Oh,
Okay.
there is a legal requirement, but it's a, you can put things in reports.
No,
But
yeah.
it
But
was
that will
called,
become a legal requirement,
will.
I think, because there's local government organisation where you're going to be legally required to review on code editions.
so you've always got supervision, so you know you do it.
Sure.
We should.
I used to report on the carbon credits on last council.
Carbon emission. Yeah, but the credit stuff there.
Yes.
Can someone please get me someone from IS?
Oh,
So, give me just a bit.
Okay. Oh, lovely. So the therefore, I've muted, so there's currently muted. I haven't been able to put up a screen to say we're muted. I'm not sure that they're live. None of our people are in the meeting. But the issue is if I cancel it, you can't rejoin live.
Right, okay.
And so
I'll just wait for the-
I just need to figure out what's happening. So sorry about that.
And I mean, legally, I know you've got to do public meetings and stuff, but if the item's just not letting it happen, it's more important that the meeting happens than it's broadcast live, isn't it?
yep.
Yeah.
Agreed.
But we could,
There we go. Then we need those other guys on to be able to join us, don't we?
We need Aon to be on. Sorry.
if we're, you, I think how you, we're muted and then we can speak freely.
That's
Then I won't speak freely. I thought we could have done ET update. Sorry, I can't go there.
It's all right. No,
It's okay.
you did some. You're on-
Right, let's just take the time to get it right. Talk
Yeah,
everything.
it's all right. Yeah, that would be interesting to see. Because they.
So is the forestry in Roxburgh, has it got potential alternative use? And in Cromwell, the land is potentially,
That's a reserve,
residential
that's actually,
land.
it's only a reserve in Roxburgh, but that those gale force winds that we had recently have decimated it actually, or the one section I'm talking about. So they're talking about harvesting it, completely harvesting it.
So either got to replant, whereas in Cromwell, would that be the whole reason, isn't it? The Sandflat Road, I don't know how many,
It's rural.
is rural, but potentially.
It's rural. I don't know what's happening. It's rural.
It's rural.
Big plan change, you did
So
with
this is
residential and that was going to take
this
this currently rural.
in this community.
It's very rural up there.
Rural.
None of them are participating.
So tax credits have sort of doubled in the last couple of, quite recently, haven't they? Per
Yes,
hectare.
I'm not exactly
want-
sure whether this
what
is,
if I
but
say-
in terms of your question about Roxburgh, there's also, and Becky will know more about this than me, there's also potential
I don't know
recreation.
what I've done wrong. What is the reason for
Like
that?
that, so it's whether the order prepared to forego
My issue is if
a
I.
commercial development or a recreation one, if you like.
No,
Yeah.
it'll be in the line.
So
I
that's why I
don't
have to
think
look
we
at
are.
the picture. But, there is a,
It's a good spot to build.
Can we ring them? Can we ring them?
there is a potential other use, as you know, for a piece of land.
Can you see if we use it?
Step that road, but not sure that that's going anywhere at this stage. Might be hitting some
We're unmuted.
We're unmuting, we're going back to live.
Neil's going to join us soon as he can.
Neil's coming in and the Aon
I
are
think
coming
bring it.
through an audio.
So they will be ringing.
So they.
Right, Neil's coming in now.
We're back live.
Neil, can you hear us? You're muted. Can I have to do something? Oh, here, Aon. Allowed to present. That's
Yeah, I can hear you. Sorry.
Is it Diana and Elaine? Is it who's coming in on Tuesday? Oh, and Matthew.
I'll come and help you in a second, Gabby, with the presentation. All right, Aon, can you hear us?
Okay, we've got Neil.
I'll come and help you in a second. Aon?
Hello, can you hear us? Yes.
Yes, we can. Thank you. We're just, sorry, let me look. We're just putting up,
Can you hear us?
the presentation onto the screen. If you can hear us.
Hello.
Hello, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Oh, good. We're just getting a presentation, I think, up on the screen.
Okay.
And then I'll hand over to Gabby.
So you can hear us okay? Hello.
Yes, thanks.
So you can hear us okay? All right.
We can hear you, yes.
You can hear us?
The presentation onto the screen. If you can hear us.
We're doing feedback. Have you got us in the background?
Hi.
Hello, can you hear us?
Hello, can
Yes,
you
we
hear
can.
us?
Yes, I can.
We're getting feedback. Have you got
Getting a presentation, I think, up on the screen.
Okay, not a problem.
Getting a delay on that, so you just.
And then I'll hand over.
you need to mute your live stream, please, or mute your live stream.
Right.
Insurance is always complicated, isn't it? Yes.
Okay, they can go. I'll get the presentation and we'll just take this.
Yeah.
All right.
Good morning, everybody. Got there in the end.
Here we go.
Right. We're.
All yours.
Is it? Okay, thank you.
Okay. I can't see what you.
If
have
Gabby
up
will
on the-
introduce you, Matthew, you just let Gabby do some opening comments and then we're away.
Excellent.
So I'm taking the report as read. So council's insurance portfolio is relatively varied due to numerous activities which council is involved in. I'm sure you'll know that insurance markets are rapidly evolving, which can impact the local government space quite significantly. So today we have Matthew Wilson, Diana McDonald and Elaine Wilson from Aon, who will be presenting to the committee on market conditions, trends and levers. And I'll now hand over to you, Matthew.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. I can't see, unfortunately, if you've got the slides up on a screen in front of you.
Coming now.
Yes.
Yep. So hopefully
Yes.
you've got your first slide, which is a nice picture of the bridge, etc., etc. So if we can go to the next slide, please, which should be an agenda slide.
Yep.
Okay, so we're going to talk through, as Gabby said, just a few bits and pieces about insurance market. But primarily this is going to be a conversation around how we work with you moving forwards in terms of a slightly different approach to the procurement of insurance. This is a conversation we are having with lots of councils at the moment. And we'll go through a few slides that, oh, excellent, thank you. We'll go through a few slides that, that cover off that approach. It's more of a risk-based approach as opposed to a procurement approach. So if we could please go to the slide that refers to the market conditions. So the next slide, please.
It should just click through every time you push the button, Gabby, so it's fine.
You might get a delay, but we're seeing it real time.
Okay, excellent. So you're looking at a slide that says Q3 2021 global market overview. This is a global overview. And this is across all policy classes. The market over the last 3 to 5 years has been what we call a hard market. We have seen premium increases across all lines. They are largely driven by global events. So the thing to bear in mind is that when we buy insurance for you, we are dealing with companies who have a global footprint. Therefore, the impacts of the global events can have an impact on the local markets. The good news is that the expectation currently for New Zealand is that we've seen a bit of an increase in capacity, which is leading to a slowing down of premium increases and premium rating. So whilst that slide you have in front of you says plus 11 to 30%, for covers such as material damage and those sort of property accounts, we're seeing in New Zealand about a plus 5% increase in rates in Q3. So it is starting to slow down. If we could go to the next slide, please. And I am mindful of time, so I will just rattle through. You've obviously got this information. The hard market over the last 3-5 years has largely, as I said, been driven by global events. So we're talking weather events mostly. We've had severe bushfires, there's been natural disaster events, flooding in Europe is one of the most recent ones. Obviously, there was a recent flooding event in the South Island. And to put some context around that, the Timaru hailstorm resulted in about 13,000 motor claims. It was a pretty significant event. So the underlying sort of push in terms of rating has been over the last wee while an increase in frequency and severity of natural disaster type events. And these slides that you're looking at here, they just give you some numbers around that. I'm not going to go through each of them individually. Again, if you can flick to the next slide, that's just another bullet point around what's been seen in the global market. And then if we could go to the slide that says market conditions. So you should be looking at a slide which has got a number of arrows. And again, this was written probably back end of Q2. So it does refer in there to sort of 17.5 to 22.5% increases. We are now seeing that slowing down, as I said. Interestingly, there is actually more capacity starting to come into the global market, but they are being very selective about where they put that capacity. So there is still a bit of a pressure on capacity, but for good, well-managed risks, we are seeing that increasing capacity to allow us to have more options. One thing insurers are looking at in greater detail is policy coverage. The obvious example of this is a clarification on wordings relating to infectious disease pandemic responses. That's a global position, obviously. So we are seeing some slight tightening of policy terms and conditions, but we are also seeing a bit of an easing in pricing as well, which is good news after the hard market we've been through for the last 3-5 years. If we could go to the next slide about liability, please. So the comments previously were about the material damage markets, so infrastructure insurance or material damage, those sort of things. One of the areas that is still an issue for local authorities is covers are relating to your professional indemnity. So these are the liability covers. They are largely driven in the greater council sector by professional indemnity claims relating to building consenting issues. That is an area that the insurers are paying particular attention to currently. But again, there was some pricing adjustments made to that market a couple of years ago, and expectations now are at pricing for that, depending on each individual council's claims, is hopefully going to be relatively flat. We are still working with insurers in terms of how the policies respond to building consenting. There's recently been a court ruling over a case between Napier City Council and the old risk pool scheme, which is being reviewed as that potentially has some issues in relation to weather tightness exclusions, but we will keep you up to speed on that as it progresses. I understand that appeal is being appealed, so there's probably going to be a period of time before we can get any concrete advice. So it's an evolving market in that space. Whilst we don't talk about it directly here, one of the other areas that is under pressure currently is cyber liability. The increase in frequency, the increase in severity as in terms of cost of those events is putting pressures on the cyber market. We're currently in negotiations with those over renewal premiums, but that is, in terms of an emerging risk, something that we will obviously keep you updated on, as well as to whether there's any major market changes in the next 6 to 12 months in respect of that. That's a real brief summary. As I say, I'm mindful of time, a real brief summary of the market and what we're seeing. So the conversation then leads on to how do we engage with the markets to get the best outcomes for you. And if we could go to the next slide, please. There is very much an insurance cycle. So one of the key things that we need to do with insurers, and we've started that this year, is we need to start talking to them early. We need to start understanding what they're going to be doing or changes that they may be making. But perhaps a bigger piece of work, and again, this isn't a comment specific to you as a council, this is a general council comment, is getting more detailed asset data, getting improved valuations. And when I mean improved, I don't necessarily mean that the numbers are incorrect. What I mean is that the numbers that are being given are for replacement values, if that's how you want to insure the asset, or that there's a process being gone through as to decide which assets you may or may not want to insure. There's also the understanding of your exposures. What are the exposures that you as a local authority have that are unique to you? And also just pulling all this information together early in the piece with you. Now, this is work that we're doing with a number of councils at the moment, and we would want to be scheduling that work with you for the coming year. So we're getting ahead of this, and that's conversations we will have separately. So it's understanding that the insurance is not just a piece of work that's done once a year just prior to renewal. It's understanding that the insurance is a sort of holistic process that can be looked at and reviewed throughout the course of the year. If we could go to the next slide, please. There's just a wee thing here that Deanna put together. I'll let Dee talk about that from a construction insurance point of view.
So we found previously that with a lot of the assets that council look after, it's getting the conversations going within council as to when these assets, especially when they're new, get put onto the insurance schedule. And we've had examples of when these have not occurred, these conversations haven't occurred, and new assets haven't been insured for up to 2 years. So we've gone through the process and talked with our construction team and put together a life cycle of what needs to be considered when going through a new project. And that's not just the insurance part, but the procurement as well. And a lot of this does come down to conversations within council, making sure that procurement is talking to finance, to the insurance team, as well as the project management team. So they're all working together. So this is just a flyer we've put together that can be used within council.
Thanks, Dee. There is a lot of information coming at you real quick, but do some questions at the end if there are any. If we could go to the next slide, please. So this one is called Insurance Levers, and this is really about understanding that the market is going to be what the market is. As I said earlier on, we're dealing with global markets, and this is now about moving the conversation with yourselves, and I say this isn't a you-specific conversation, is moving the conversation about insurance away from just being a straight procurement conversation, we need to buy XYZ insurance policies, to looking at it from being a more risk-focused type conversation. And there's a slide at the end which I'll go through which sort of explains that model. But this is talking about there's things that you can control and things that you can't control. So if you press through the animations on that, you should get all three come up. So how do we effectively manage the cost of insurance? Well, you've got to first understand what you can and can't control. So that's the market as such. And then we need to understand what are the decisions that you want to make around how much insurance do you buy, what type of policies do you buy. It's moving it, as I say, from that procurement to a more strategic point of view. And I think if we can jump 2 slides, please, to go to a slide which is called Risk Governance and Methodology. This is the real crux of this. So hopefully you will be able to see shortly. If we keep going, please. Yep. And again, go one more.
Is it risk governance methodology?
Yeah, that's the one. There's a coloured hexagon.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah, excellent. Okay, thank you. So this is something our risk management team put together, and I'll just give you a real quick back history to it. When we were in the hard part of the market, when insurance premiums for councils were going up 30, 40%, a lot of councils came to us and said, we need an insurance strategy. We need to cut the cost of our insurance. And I slightly flippantly said, well, that's a little bit tail wagging the dog, because the driver in that instance has been how much the insurance premiums are. And in a risk framework, insurance is just a risk transfer mechanism. It is one way that you can treat risks that you have as an organisation. And what we should be doing is looking at it from the other end of the spectrum, is working out what your exposures are. What is your financial ability to deal with some of those exposures? Do you understand the value of those exposures? What mitigations do you have? How resilient is the organisation? Again, that could be balance sheet resilience, or that could be asset resilience, for example. And then at the end of that, once we've understood all of that, then we can go and buy an insurance program that is fit for your particular risk tolerance and risk management framework. And there are some real simple examples, and this is quite a lot of work to be done, and it's something we want to do with you and work through. But some of the simple examples are things like excess levels under your material damage policy. We act for some councils who have excess levels as low as $10,000. Now, if you relate that to your own household insurance, where you might have an excess of 500, 2,000, then that sort of makes sense. But some of these councils have millions and millions and millions of dollars worth of property. If they were a corporate entity, and I use the phrase in parenthesis, an equivalent property owner would probably have a deductible of $250,000, $100,000. They wouldn't be looking at having a deductible level that low. Now that has an impact on pricing, obviously. So that's just one real simple example. But to understand whether there's a cost benefit to you, we obviously need to get pricing with those options, but then we also need to understand what your appetite is like. Do you want to insure everything so that you don't have to have that exposure? Or do you have enough balance sheet resilience to potentially wear, if you said $100,000 excess, if you had a $90,000 loss, can you wear that? If you had two $90,000 losses in 1 year, could you wear that? So these are conversations that we'd like to have and to get an understanding of, and sort of follow that process so that the net result is that you then end up looking at an insurance program where there has been a clear decision-making route to get to what you buy, not just a transactional purchase to buy a list of insurances. That was quite hard work, if I'm honest, not being able to see the screens very well. That is a real overview of what we want to try and do, working with you over the next 12 months or so, and how we can further refine insurances. And hopefully at the end of that, you end up with something which is cost effective, meets your risk appetite and risk tolerances. Are there any questions around any of this? This is just sort of setting a flavour for what we want to try and achieve, and we've had these conversations with Gabby and others about getting something pulled together for the next 12 months.
Okay, well, it's sensible to me. My experience often is that insurance is sort of suddenly at the last minute, sign this off, the policy needs to renew next week, sort of thing. So this makes a lot of sense. And Leanne, you and Gabrielle.
We've been working with them in partnership with them now. We joined, we sort of popped on the end of a local authority shared service arrangement last year. It's the North Island one, although a lot of the South Island are part of it as well. And we'll now form more of the South Island Aon collective. So we've been working with them for the last few months, trying to understand the market. This risk process, risk focus as opposed to procurement focus will now be the next 12 months. We will review our policies for 1 November and then go into a much more detailed risk process over the next 12 months and really do what we can. It's not so much, it's not a focus hasn't been about saving money, it's been about buying the best bang for the buck, so to speak. And they talked about cyber security, and you'll have a presentation later on today from Glenn. But things like that are moving, and we've seen it in New Zealand from the big hits. We need to be able to make sure we're prepared for them and we can do the right risk focus, which does translate into a rate impact, obviously. So you wear 2 hats, and we'll work very closely with them to see how we can maximise our protection without blowing the budget, so to speak.
So that'll work into the program. I saw that, sorry, we've lost the slide now, but it had the year. Yes, that can kind of work through.
So that will start the new round. We will be renewing our insurances for 1 November. We moved all our insurances to 1 November instead of 30 June because it was just too challenging to pull the data together as we're trying to deal with the end of the year and revaluations. So we'll work through and then we'll spend the next 12 months bringing things to the table as we understand and how we can understand the risk appetite and then understand.
Whilst there's that sort of approach of ensuring the right things in the best possible way, to use your words, different words. I had a chat recently with Leanne too, just considering the environment we're in and encompassing that into our insurance discussions as well, in particular around some of the reform, the potential risk on organisations with staffing and other things, for work programs, with deadlines, etc. But also the water services bill that has new liabilities and stuff around professional indemnity and that sort of thing. And making sure that we're appropriately covered for that, in particular if the council were to make a decision to opt out, which would increase our risk.
And we'll pick that up with these guys over the next very short period of time to cover that. Great.
I have two questions. So first, I assume Alan's still online.
I believe so.
The terminology capacity. Can you explain that a little bit better? I kind of understood it, but I need a bit more clarity on that.
Yeah, no, sure. Sure. So when we talk about capacity, we're basically talking about the amount of capital that is in the market. Just think of it as the amount of money that's going into the market that insurers are willing to earmark against an insurance program. So what happened a few years ago in the Lloyd's markets was some syndicates in Lloyd's were underperforming. They weren't doing very well. And the Lloyd's regulators said to them, you've got to lose the bottom 10% of your poor performing clients. So that led to them ditching a load of clients. That then led to a reduction in the amount of available insurer capital, if you want, as a way of explaining it, that was there. And then you get into a supply and demand cycle. If the amount of capital is being reduced, then if you want to buy some of that capital, it costs you more money. And it is simple supply and demand. So that was one of the factors that started us getting into the hard market cycle. Everybody was chasing the same capital. So you had to be prepared to pay for that capital. Now what we're seeing is an increase in the amount of capital that is going into the insurance market. Therefore, if you are a good risk, a well-managed risk, there is more capital there is more accessible capital, which means then that the cost per $1 million, let's say, of that capital is effectively coming down. So that it's just sort of the volume of insurance that can be offered, if you want to think of it like that. There's a finite amount, but we're seeing an increase in that amount. Does that, hopefully that sort of makes sense?
Yes, 90% perhaps. Okay.
I mean, we can see something. We've got quite a few papers on this. So,
sorry, what's confusing is when you're talking about capital. You're talking about, yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Because they're using capital in the sense you're using it is not something that I'm familiar with.
Okay. If you think of it this way, when you buy an insurance, if you're buying an insurance policy, what you are effectively doing is, if you insure a building for $100 million, you spend whatever, $10,000 insuring that building. What you're actually doing is buying the potential to have to use $100 million of somebody else's money to rebuild your building. So it's effectively, I refer to it as capital, as available capital. It's probably not the correct word to use. I'm having trouble hearing you, I'm afraid.
No, now I do understand, so that's fine. Yep.
Okay.
So the second question I had was around valuations, and I'm talking about councils in this instance. When it comes to claims time, does the history suggest that the valuations are correct?
Historically,
How do you
insurance
deal- how do you
has
deal
dealt
with
with. Yeah, okay, a very good question. Historically, insurance has been dealt with by finance teams, and this isn't a slight on finance teams. If you ask a finance person what the value of something is, chances are they're likely to give you the optimized depreciated replacement cost. And put very simply, if you have a $10 million building and the accounting people have put an ODRC on it of $7 million, and you have a claim on that building and it is shown on your insurance schedule as $7 million, the insurers will pay you that figure. They won't pay you, they'll pay you that figure, but what we should be getting declared is the replacement value of the property, not the financial depreciated value. And we've spent, Dee and I have probably had this conversation lots and lots of times with other councils, and you still see occasionally an ODRC number going on a property schedule when actually what we want to see is a replacement value. Or you can either insure something for indemnity. That's a slightly different concept, but it's just making sure that the value that is put on the insurance schedule is a representative value of what it's going to cost to replace that item, because that's what the insurance is based on. In terms of how you deal with it, we just need to make sure we're getting replacement values or an agreed value that everyone's comfortable with.
Okay, yeah, I understand that. I guess that in some instances they'll be carrying some of the loss themselves if they want to reduce their premiums.
And we do a mix, because there's some buildings will go, it's a bit like a depreciation. If we lost it, would we, the council, replace the entire building, or would we go out to our community as well?
Yeah.
So there's a mix of how we deal with these things.
Thank you.
Any more questions? No? Great. Well, thank you. That looks like a really good piece of work that's going to be kicking off next year. Thanks, Debbie.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your time. Sorry about technology issues. We'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Okay, so we're moving on to the legislative compliance warrant of fitness. Alex, yeah.
Yeah, good on you, your photo. The legislative compliance warrant of fitness is our framework that identifies the key legislation that council must comply with, and it also gives our highest level overview of how that compliance is assured. There's nearly 200 acts that get council in some way, so we have established some priority areas for attention, and finance consider is really going to be a living document that each year we go, it will evolve further, and the standard for compliance is really to the best of our ability, and each time we complete it, that ability will evolve. So it's our second year bringing it here to audit and risk. And I'll start with the outcome before I move through the process of how we pulled it together. So the outcome was that council complied with the key pieces of legislation, and there are many systems in place to do so. There are a few areas where we are already compliant with the requirements of legislation, but we've got some policy work underway that will reflect in our documentation how we do that better. The main ones there being privacy, the LGOIMAs, Local Government Official Information and Meetings Act, and child protection. Finance is assured with subject matter experts who are familiar with the legislation and its requirements. External measures with statutory timeframes, we have a few external bodies we refer to, internal systems and procedures, and we have some memberships with organisations. The big one for this is Florida, the local government organisation, because they put together some documents with Simpson Grierson that are guidance documents for local government on how local compliance. And I've relied quite heavily on those and pulling this report together. Looking at the 2020 warrant of fitness, there were 2 areas in that where it was suggested we pay some more attention. There was the lack of a copyright policy and also a little behind the timeframes on the district plan to the decision that was made with council. That continued, just added the timeframes for that into the report so you can see. And the copyright policy, we've got a policy in place to ensure we're covered. And there's a little bit more work going on for the information management and record keeping policy work that's due out within the next year. I also took all pieces of legislation and made a long list. So that's why there's 2 documents sitting aside there. And the longer list has all active pieces of legislation that affect council in some way. So that includes the Local Government Act, which dictates what we do day to day, all the way down to some of those local reserve acts and the 30s that bequeath us apart. And finally, when we move into the next review, the 2022 review, sorry, there are 3 areas of focus that are suggested. The first one is to look at the processes that capture within council that capture these changes to legislation. So at the moment we've talked about the legislation and where it's at, and I'd like to just find a bit more detail on how these changes are captured within the organisation, spread through and reflected in our policies. A really good one for that example is the Leave Management Act. There were some changes to the provision of domestic violence leave that picked up by human resources and the policies updated. So it's just reflecting how those processes happen. The second is just to keep further in our understanding of our legislative responsibilities. That's always going to be an objective for this one. And the third one is the level of detail. So as you'll have seen reading it, it's a very, very high level document that's basically saying we refer to a third party here, we have a process here. In the future, we'll need to start pulling out some of these focus areas and explaining which third party that is, which process it is. And I've suggested we start by looking at the Privacy Policy 2020, Health and Safety at Work Act 2015, and the Climate Change Response Zero Carbon Amendment Act 2019. Those 3 have been chosen as they're all relatively recent pieces of legislation with quite heavy impacts for council. And there's also a lot of work that's happening in that space within the organisation that we'll just be bringing to reflect. So with that, I'd like to hand back to the chair.
Okay. Looks like a really good process. I mean, from my perspective, I mean, that's the best thing, and I know it'll keep evolving. And you mentioned the Privacy Act 2020, which was good because I noticed in the list of legislation, you've still got the old Privacy Act.
I do. It's the way I was listing it was to refer to the year the Privacy Act was in place. And the Privacy Act gets referred to both of the old one and the new one. So I struggled with that. At the time I wrote it, I used that and I switched. So
Yeah, okay. Because that, I mean, that's the first thing, isn't it? It's like you said, making sure that when there's new acts that
we capture.
You have a process to capture them. So that was reassuring. Questions or comments? We've got then the actual compliance warrant of fitness focus areas as well. Anybody?
A couple of pedantic ones. One was just I noticed the Local Government Act wasn't highlighted. That might have just been noticed. And
in the list of
in the list, yeah.
That wasn't.
And that's probably just for comment. I just don't understand how the Vincent County Empowering Community Centres Act 1970 is still on the law. Obviously, it's not our problem.
A lot of them too are largely redacted. There's just 1 or 2 lines that haven't been. So
It's crazy, isn't it? Yeah, someone had a look at it. God. Very interesting. Okay.
Well, one thing I did do, because I saw on page 32, you listed responsibilities for audit and risk. So I sort of honed in on that a wee bit. And when I went to the list, the policy register list, there are another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Or 4 than are listed here. So I think if you can just reconcile that to the actual register, that would be good. But I thought this, you know, I mean, this was a very good piece of work. I thought it was really good. And what I think too, the right policies, like you said, the ones that we've got focus on are the right ones as well, yeah. Okay, any other questions? No, I will move that we receive the report.
Second,
Thank you. All those in favour say aye.
right?
Against? Thank you. And we've got you for the policy register.
The policy and strategy register has had several pieces of work completed. I'll just go through them to start with. We've added the equal employment opportunity, discrimination, harassment and bullying policy. The performance management policy has been completed. The cybersecurity policy is on the agenda for today. We've added the copyright policy, and there's been a soft review of the grants policy with a further review. There are also many policies presented through the long-term plan process. There were 5 that came here to audit and risk, and an additional 5 that were reviewed and through that process. We've also added some new policies as future work items. That includes the unmanned aerial vehicle policy, a CCTV policy that will cover closed circuit television networks in the wider district, and that will replace the standalone Molyneux Pole CCTV policy, the child protection policy, and we've added in the health and safety framework, which is a bit of an overview of all of the different pieces of work that are happening in the health and safety space. There were a few pieces that were reprioritised. That was largely due to the extra pressures added through lockdown, and many of those are still in their final or later stages. The 2 particularly important ones for this committee are the Lagoima policy and the privacy policy. I understand both of those at the final stages ready for executive review, so they should be moving through very shortly. One policy review that should have come to this meeting was the staff interest manual. That one was an oversight. It's a policy that's reached the 1-year mark and was due for a soft review at 1 year. It was mistakenly programmed in our system at 3 years. So we've picked that up and programmed it to happen. I believe it's scheduled for about December. And we'll put that in. Finally, with the permission of the chair, I'd like to very briefly hand over to the Executive Manager Corporate Services on the staff delegations register.
So the staff delegations register, we thought we were talking about the full delegations. The staff delegation register is an operational one, of course, so it was signed off by the Chief Exec, and that flows out of the main council delegations where all staff delegations go through to our Chief Exec. So we had, the oversight had not realised that needed to come here to audit and risk. And that's where the confusion was around delegations.
Yeah, so it says, yeah, so 1 in the register it says it should, but 2 in the overarching paper it said it did.
Yeah, that's
And
my
that was
error.
the other sort of question. So 1 it didn't, and but it will.
It will do.
Okay.
So it will come to audit and risk. And then it goes on Chief Exec as opposed to council.
Yeah.
My apologies for that.
Yeah, no, that's all right. Okay. I think it's advancing and looking tinier all the time. So I had one question and I raised it just in our pre-meeting chat, and I know councils are a little bit strange and unusual. In that, under the Health and Safety at Work Act, council laws do not have accountability for health and safety, but they still have responsibility for health and safety. But the health and safety policy and framework at the moment sits as a CEO responsibility and isn't one that goes up to council. I suppose I just that's all right, that it should just be sitting CEO and not need to have oversight, or that the council should have oversight. I'm not saying it must, but I think it's something for council to consider, because council is thus still responsible whilst not accountable for health and safety.
Yeah, well, the responsibility isn't evaporated by the fact that you're not going to be strung home drawn and quartered if something goes wrong. There's still a degree of responsibility there, and it does leave the CEO isolated. What do you think, Sancho?
I'm looking deep, I feel agnostic. I guess what my comments would be is there was some commentary on the role of council in health and safety in the code of conduct as well, which you sign up. And that if something did come here, I'd see it as being for receiving only, because otherwise council would be deciding operational work programs in terms of, so if it was a receiving oversight thing more than a, but it's probably more at that very much upper level, not at the detail, but at the sort of health and policy statement type level. But I leave it with you to think about, really. It's just it's a little bit unique under the Act how it works for councils. And, you know, if you're in a corporate entity, you would have directors well and truly responsible and accountable, and therefore, you know, likewise some policies. I'd be very happy to delegate all responsibility. Liability.
You can't delegate over the others.
Yeah.
Would be equally happy not to accept.
It's something just to put in mind too.
There's not an excess there. We certainly don't want to have.
Yeah, what do we
councillors
think
get
about it?
into the-
Yeah.
Yeah, it's going to be really at all.
Or just increase the risk of health.
Right, well, we've had a discussion, yes.
Just one. So I see the speed limit bylaws there, and it's on. Are they due to work prioritisation? Who's actually doing that work?
So
Is it Julie?
that's sitting between roading and ourselves. That one is at the point now where a series of areas for the streets to be slow have been identified and provided for roading. We've written up the bylaws, we've got those two pieces of work together. But before it goes any further, our roading services manager would really like to go and drive all of those streets ourselves, just to make sure that we agree with all of these speed limit changes, and also to check for any areas where slowing speed is going to have an additional impact. So we're looking for any driveways where slower cars are going to change the way that it's approached. Just these extra level of safety hazards, and that's the portion that was slowed down due to COVID. So that one will be picking back up now. He can physically go out to those spots again, and we should hopefully by the next meeting.
Okay, so I was thinking more about our rural roads.
Steve, I think Julie's got.
So they have been out, they've driven all the roads now, I've reviewed what the proposals are. They're going to the next lot of community board meetings to discuss the proposals with the boards. They'll then come to council in a workshop session to discuss proposals with the councillors. There's a lot of stakeholder consultation that then takes place. We're legally required to, there's a list of stakeholders we have to consult with, and then we'll bring a statement proposal to council. Quite controversial, so that is why we want to talk to council, community, councillors before putting it into the public meeting. We're anticipating public consultation early next year. There are a lot of rural roads. They're included. It's not just you.
A couple of things, Madam Chair, if that's Stephen, if you have that. I just, for personal interest, the child protection policy, very high overview. What is that? What children do we need to protect?
Child protection, that one is very tricky. So we're a specified organisation under the Act there. That means anytime we're working with children, we have a level of responsibility. That's largely for us librarians and health.
Yeah, cool.
There's also an extra layer anytime where school groups come in.
Makes perfect sense once explained.
And you don't have a policy yet, which is quite a while since you need to have had one.
Yes, we have the process for the vet check-in, so that policy exists, which is what we're, the minimum standard we're required to have, that one's in place. The extra level we're working on is more the training for each person who is classified as a children's worker, to ensure that that next level beyond the compliance as a council is compliant for the educator standard essentially.
Okay.
I just have one further, it's probably more a comment than anything else, but I'm looking down here, looking at the drone policy and the CCTV policy. I'll be being flippant, but that was a cut and paste, that's been done everywhere, hasn't it?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
They're largely quick in cutting and pasting, pulling them across as what other areas have done. And we're now in the stage of taking it to each business owner and applying it to central Otago context.
Fraud, bribery and corruption and protected disclosure, it says they've had internal reviews and therefore they're now next due for review in October, but this committee hasn't seen those.
No, that was just the internal soft reviews, yeah.
But we have responsibility for both of those under the register.
I'm happy, so I'm just.
Yeah, because I'm not sure what soft review means, but if it is required to be reviewed and this committee has responsibility for them, then this committee has to be, because we can't just, otherwise they just stay down in somewhere else and they're not coming. So if we could get those, that's fine. They're not doing what we need to do.
The soft review essentially is we take a look at the policy, we have a discussion with this with the key staff who apply the policy, any tricky things that have come across, and it's essentially a bit of a desktop exercise and not a fundamental review. So unless of course we find any challenges with it, then we haven't traditionally been taken up to council or the committee, so we can change that.
Yeah, practically practical, but absolutely, if the committee's got responsibility and it's meant to be reviewed annually, then we need to review it annually. That's the way I see it. And it may come up and have no changes and that's fine. But I think that's, because otherwise years could go by and we wouldn't have seen it. And yet it's been said, it's been, get those next time.
Other thing, and it might be the way my brain works or doesn't, but in the table that had all the, bits and pieces on page 65, I kind of struggled with one column which is date issued, review beginning, and another one due for review or completion, because they're kind of four different things in two different columns, I thought, my reading of it. So when I read it, I didn't know whether, the adverse weather policy is actually being completed in September 2020, happy days, we're good, or it was due for completion, due for review in September 2020 and we're a year behind.
We're a year behind.
So I just found it a wee bit hard to understand,
That's what it, if it's a past date,
Yeah.
it's still sitting there, it's overdue.
Right, okay.
Initially, I thought I'd change the column here to reflect that better or colour code it, and then I decided instead of just bring them all up to date.
Okay. That's just me. Yeah, that's the better way.
Okay, so we'll do a catch up and see those next time, but it's just kind of it. I also move that we receive the report.
Second.
Excellent. All those in favour say aye.
Aye.
Against? Carried. Thank you.
Good.
Audit New Zealand. Two more.